When it comes to rock and roll music from the 1950s to the present, our next guest really has the whole lowdown. Here's a disc jockey with WNBC Radio in New York and the author of Rock on Volume 2. Yeah, that's nice. Here is Norm N. Nite. Welcome to it. Welcome. Thank you. 3,000 miles. I've heard so many varying stories on how the whole thing started. How did rock and roll music start? Did it start with a DJ?
Yes, it did start in about 1951 in Cleveland, Ohio. A disc jockey by the name of Alan Freed. The music at the time was called race records, sepia music, rhythm and blues, and they wanted a different connotation for it. So that rock is an expression that a lot of jazz musicians and people in the business were saying, we're going to rock tonight, we're going to do this. And the words kept popping up into the songs that were being recorded at the time. So Alan kept hearing these records that he was playing, and he kept pounding the desk and saying, we're going to rock, we're going to rock and roll. And the phrase just was born like that. And that from that point on, they started calling it rock and roll. And of course, today it's simply called rock. They cut off the roll. I don't know whatever happened to the roll.
Yeah.
We're going to switch back to Central Park now and Ernie Anastas.
Well, we're back at Central Park, and there are people that are sitting up in the trees, people who are sitting on the ground, holding each other, hugging one another, and perhaps remembering what just happened a short while ago, where they held hands, looked at one another, and did what Yoko Ono wanted, prayed for the soul of John Lennon. We talked about John Kennedy earlier. You know, it was said that if John Kennedy gave us our generation, the Beatles gave us our music. And we've had an opportunity to talk with several people from the New York area who were very close to the Beatles, and particularly with John Lennon. Norman Nite, who was an author of many books on the history of rock and roll music and also a radio personality at CBS here in New York. Norm, I'm glad you're with us today, and you were close to John, and we talked a little bit about why he wanted to live in New York City, or perhaps a theory that you had. Why don't you tell us more about that?
Well, I had a chance to meet him a couple of times, and one of the things that I really thought about is regards to the conversations he had about American rock and roll, which was an interesting summation I had on my own part, and that was that John Lennon liked rock and roll music of the 1950s, and he really was and New York City itself in 1955, 56 was really the hub of where rock and roll, all the major recording acts lived here, all the studios were here and everything. And I'm sure growing up in England and watching the motion pictures and seeing the various performers, he had a kind of a feeling for New York in that. And when he finally had a chance to make it, out of all the places in the United States, or all the places in the world for that matter, that he could have lived, he thought about this town as being the birthplace really of rock and roll. And he was so close to rock and roll and the early rock and roll and the various performers like the Chuck Berrys and the Fats Dominoes and the groups, that I think in a way he felt by being a part of the city, he'd be a part of rock's beginnings and rock's birth, and it was a very, very fertile area for him to be able to do things.
And this area here becoming really his home.
Yes, and I think that people like John Lennon and other people that live in New York bring it back once again to New York City, because this was the capital. Then it shifted out to California and every place else around the country. But I guess he was one of those persons in his own subliminal way wanting to show people that this is truly the capital of rock and roll.
Thank you, Norm, for sharing those thoughts with us. And now we will go back to you, Roger.
From Philadelphia called Chubby Checker helped to revive the sagging music industry by getting Americans to dance to something new called the twist. Now Chubby's back on the scene with a new album, his first in 15 years. Also with us today is the leading rock and roll historian in the country, Norm Nite. He's a disc jockey and a lecturer from New York City. It appears that rock and roll is here to stay. I'm Nancy Merrill. This is People Are Talking. You're a historian of rock and roll trivia as well. Not that Chubby was any part of any trivia, mind you, in the country. Where does he stand in positioning rock and roll, where it started, where it came from?
Well, actually,
there really were three milestones with rock and roll, that being Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and this man here. Because he got the whole country in 1960 dancing, and they haven't stopped. And the interesting thing about Chubby, above and beyond the fact of his new album and the fact that he has had records selling all over the world, is his acceptance over the world. Wherever he travels, the shows he does, the audiences just love him, no matter where he goes. It's that thing, that energy he has on stage, that even if he goes to a foreign-speaking country and performs, just the energy on stage of what he does, that's why he's the way he looks, trim.
This is a very special year for the music industry. It's the 30th anniversary of something called rock and roll. With us this morning is Norman Nite, who besides playing the oldies on a radio station here in New York, has also compiled and updated a book called Rock On, which serves as the unofficial encyclopedia of rock music. 30 years old, where was it born and when?
Janie was born March 21st, 1952 in Cleveland, Ohio, by a disc jockey at that time by the name of Alan Freed. And he had the marvelous idea of bringing together the acts that he was playing on the radio and wondered what the response might be if he had them on stage. And there were something like about 20,000 people that converged on this scene. Rock and roll began at that particular time. He came to New York in 1954, and as they say, the rest is history.
Well, it started in Cleveland. What over the years have been some of the other capitals?
Well, it started there because of Alan Freed being there, and then he came to New York, and of course the emphasis then shifted to New York. Then when Dick Clark in 1957 had American Bandstand, the scene shifted to Philadelphia, and then of course the California scene in the 60s with the Beach Boys, and then Motown also in the early 60s. So geographically it's bounced around all over the United States at different parts of the country, and every part of the country has contributed a sound, if you will, the Nashville sound, the Memphis sound, the California sound. There's been a specific sound from just about all the parts of the country in the United States.